I sat at the long dining table during my husband's family anniversary dinner, trying my best to blend into the background. My father-in-law, Richard Caldwell, leaned back in his expensive leather chair and swirled his wine with a look of pure arrogance. He suddenly laughed, catching everyone's attention, and turned his cold gaze toward me. "Vivienne, remind me again, what exactly do you do?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Besides pretending that little manager title actually matters in the real world." The table went silent for a painful half-second as the air left the room. Then, awkward laughter broke out among the guests as my cheeks began to burn with deep embarrassment. Every eye in the room was fixed on me, waiting for a response that I wasn't ready to give. I looked at my husband, Daniel, hoping he would say something to defend me, but he just stared down at his plate in silence. Richard wasn't done yet. He leaned forward and added that I was likely only hired because the company was desperate for warm bodies. My throat tightened as I fought back tears, but inside, I knew a secret. Richard had no idea that I was the one who built the systems he used every single day. The next morning at brunch, Richard doubled down on his insults, mocking what he called my career phase, and suggesting I should just quit before I embarrassed the family further. Daniel told me later to just ignore his father, but I was hurt that he still refused to challenge the man's blatant disrespect. When I arrived at work, the atmosphere was thick with tension because a critical system failure had paralyzed the entire company platform. While senior engineers scrambled and panicked, I sat down at my desk and quietly went to work. I navigated through the complex layers of code that I had designed myself and managed to fix the entire breach in under 10 minutes. My immediate supervisor thanked me for the quick work, but then he warned me not to act above my position or draw too much attention to myself. I felt like I was being squeezed from both sides, belittled at home and suppressed at the office. However, just as I was about to pack up, a private message flashed on my screen that changed everything. It was a direct summons: "CEO wants to meet you personally tonight." I realized then that my invisible role was starting to shift into the light much faster than I expected. A major corporate client almost walked away that afternoon after a massive system outage threatened them with millions of dollars in potential losses. From his executive office, Richard called the tech department incompetent, never once suspecting that I was the only person stabilizing the entire infrastructure behind the scenes. I stayed at the office late into the night, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I rewrote sections of corrupted code. While I was deep in the digital trenches, Daniel sent me a casual text asking if I would be attending yet another one of his father's repetitive family dinners. It felt like two completely different worlds were colliding: my high-stakes, invisible career and their small-minded, disrespectful image of me as a temporary hire. I knew the CEO was silently watching my work logs from his own terminal, and I could see my clearance levels escalating in real time. By the time the sun started to rise, I had saved the company's biggest contract, but to the Caldwell family, I was still just a girl playing at having a job. The gap between their perception and my reality was growing into a canyon, and I was starting to wonder how much longer I could keep the truth hidden. The following afternoon, Richard cornered me outside the office building, looking me up and down with a sneer. He told me flatly that I lacked executive presence, and that I should stop wasting my time chasing leadership roles that I would never get. To my horror, I later learned that he actually submitted a formal complaint to HR recommending that I be demoted for being unproductive. I waited for the axe to fall, but then something strange happened. The CEO himself rejected Richard's complaint without offering any explanation to the executive board. Instead of being called into a disciplinary meeting, I received a private invitation to a highly confidential leadership briefing. When I walked into the secure conference room, I saw my name listed at the very top of a restricted access chart. I realized then that while Richard was busy trying to destroy my career, the highest level of leadership was preparing to elevate me. I sat in that room and listened to executives talk about the future of the company, knowing that I was the one holding the keys to the very systems they were discussing. Richard's attempts to push me down were finally starting to have the opposite effect, and the look of confusion on his face was becoming my favorite sight. I was working late one evening when I stumbled upon a series of internal emails that made my blood run cold. I discovered that Richard had been actively undermining my work for months, sending secret memos to department heads trying to block every single one of my potential promotions. When I showed these emails to Daniel, he simply brushed it off as standard business politics and told me not to take it personally. His refusal to see his father's cruelty was becoming a wall between us. However, my spirits were lifted when a private note appeared in my inbox from the CEO. It said, "Ignore the noise. Your work is critical to the future of this company." That was the moment I truly realized I was not as replaceable as Richard Caldwell wanted everyone to believe. I began to see that the CEO was intentionally shielding me from Richard's influence while he prepared the company for a major change. I stopped worrying about Richard's petty complaints and started focusing entirely on the massive architecture project I had been assigned. I was learning that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard, it just needs to be indispensable. My father-in-law was playing a game of titles, but I was the one actually running the board. One morning, I was reviewing the company's core infrastructure when I noticed something that left me completely stunned. The entire system architecture I had built over the years was now officially labeled as the Hartley Protocol across all company servers. I hadn't authorized the use of my name, so I went to the CEO's office to ask for an explanation. He looked at me with a steady gaze and explained that my original code had saved the company from a total collapse years ago, long before Richard joined the board. The CEO wanted to ensure that my contribution was permanently recognized in the system's DNA. Meanwhile, Richard continued to walk around the office telling everyone that he was the one responsible for the company's record-breaking success. He was living a massive lie, and I could see that the foundation of that lie was about to break into pieces. It was surreal to hear him brag about his systems while I was literally looking at my own name embedded in the source code on my screen. I realized that Richard's arrogance had made him blind to the very person keeping his world spinning. He thought he was the architect, but he was really just a guest in a house that I had built from the ground up. At another mandatory family dinner, Richard felt the need to publicly compare me to real professionals he knew, suggesting that I had only gotten lucky with my current position. He laughed as he told the guests that I was probably just a diversity hire who did nothing but push paper all day. Once again, Daniel stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his wine glass as his father insulted his wife. Halfway through the main course, my phone began to buzz frantically in my pocket. It was a high-priority alert, executive emergency. Your presence required immediately. Richard saw me check my phone and laughed loudly, mocking me by saying, "See? Even they don't trust her to be unsupervised for one night." He had absolutely no idea that I was being summoned because the entire global system had just crashed, and I was the only person with the deep-level knowledge required to fix it. I stood up from the table, ignored his sneer, and walked out of the room without saying a word. The Caldwells thought I was being sent to the principal's office, but in reality, I was being called to save the empire they were so proud of. I drove to the office in the dark, ready to prove exactly what a lucky hire could do. I didn't even have time to get to my desk before I had to open my laptop. While the rest of the Caldwell family was probably eating dessert and laughing at my expense, I was hunched over my screen, fighting a near-catastrophic system breach. Richard's mocking voice was still ringing in my ears, but I blocked it out and focused on the cascading lines of red error code. I worked with a precision that comes only from years of being the one who actually does the work. Suddenly, the screens in the command center flickered, and all the company dashboards turned from red back to green. Within seconds, the CEO personally called my direct line. "Whoever just restored the system saved us millions of dollars in damages," he said, his voice full of genuine relief. When Richard heard the news the next day, he immediately assumed that it had been the work of the senior engineers he had hired. He went around taking credit for managing the crisis, never realizing that the person he had insulted at dinner was the one who had actually performed the miracle. I watched him from my cubicle, feeling a strange mix of pity and power. He was so caught up in his own fantasy that he couldn't see the hero standing right in front of him. A few days later, I received a formal warning from HR based on a series of complaints filed by Richard. He had accused me of insubordination and unprofessional behavior during the recent system crisis. I felt a momentary surge of panic, but it vanished within minutes when the CEO personally stepped in and overrode the warning. Instead of a reprimand, I was handed an official document that left me breathless. My title had been upgraded to Senior Strategic Systems Architect, a position that placed me far above Richard's direct influence. Richard was absolutely furious when he found out that I wasn't being punished and had instead been promoted. For the first time, Daniel began to look genuinely uncomfortable with the situation. He realized that the dynamic in the company was shifting and that his father was losing his grip on the narrative. I could see the confusion in Richard's eyes as he tried to figure out why his power was failing. He was used to being the most powerful man in the room, but he was starting to realize that the room had changed. I wasn't just a temporary hire anymore. I was a senior executive, and my new office was closer to the CEOs than it ever would be. The company atmosphere shifted again when an extensive internal audit was launched after several financial inconsistencies were found in the departments that Richard oversaw. As a senior architect, my system access logs were some of the first to be requested by the auditing team. I complied immediately, knowing that my records were perfectly clean. What I didn't realize at the time was that the audit was slowly but surely pointing towards someone very close to Richard. I spent my days analyzing data flow and noticed patterns that suggested someone had been manipulating the financial reports to hide department failures. Richard seemed more on edge than usual, barking orders and trying to shut down the investigation before it could gain momentum. He tried to blame the glitches on my new system protocols, but the CEO wasn't listening to his excuses anymore. I could see the walls closing in on him, even if he couldn't see them yet. He had spent so much time trying to expose my supposed incompetence that he had forgotten to cover his own tracks. The very systems he mocked were now being used to systematically dismantle his web of lies, and I was the one holding the magnifying glass. That night at home, I finally confronted Daniel about his father's increasingly erratic and hostile behavior. Daniel looked tired and finally admitted the truth. My dad doesn't like feeling like he's being replaced. He explained that Richard saw my rising success as a direct threat to his own legacy within the Caldwell family. However, even after admitting this, Daniel still refused to stand up for me or tell his father to stop the attacks. He was still trapped in the habit of seeking his father's approval, even at the cost of our own happiness. I sat in our living room and started to question whether I was fighting just a workplace battle or a much larger family war that I could never truly win. I realized that as long as I stayed with Daniel, I would always be tied to Richard's toxicity. The promotion at work was giving me the professional freedom I needed, but my personal life was still anchored to a man who wouldn't defend me. I felt a deep sense of loneliness, knowing that the people who were supposed to be my family were the ones rooting for me to fail. I went to bed that night realizing that the company keys weren't the only thing I needed to change. I needed to decide who I wanted by my side. The next morning, the CEO called me into a very private meeting in his office. He looked at me with a great deal of respect and said, "Vivienne, you're not just an employee here. You're the backbone of this entire company." He told me that he had been watching how I handled Richard's constant harassment with such professionalism and grace. Then, he hinted that a massive leadership restructuring was coming and that I was going to be central to the new organization. He explained that he needed someone he could trust implicitly to handle the company's most sensitive infrastructure. I felt a surge of pride that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, someone in a position of power was seeing me for who I actually was, not for who my father-in-law wanted me to be. The CEO told me to stay focused and not to let the outside noise distract me from the important work ahead. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I could handle anything Richard Caldwell threw my way. I was being given a chance to lead, and I was determined to show everyone that the temporary hire was actually the only one capable of holding the whole thing together. Richard tried one last desperate move to stop my progress by attempting to have me move to a lower technical role through his remaining executive influence. He argued that my new position was too much for someone of my limited experience and that I was better suited for maintenance tasks. However, the CEO immediately countered his move by expanding my authority even further, giving me oversight of the very departments Richard was trying to protect. I could see Richard beginning to suspect that something was very wrong. He started asking himself, why does every attempt I make to push her down only make her rise higher? He was used to his influence being absolute, but now he was finding that his words carried no weight in the boardroom. He became increasingly paranoid, checking his office for listening devices and questioning his own staff about their loyalty. He was losing his mind because he couldn't control me anymore. I didn't have to fight him with insults or drama, I just had to keep doing my job better than anyone else. Richard was drowning in a sea of his own making, and the more he struggled, the faster he sank. I was simply watching from the shore, waiting for the tide to finally turn. While I was doing a deep dive into the company's legal archives, I found a set of old documents that left me completely speechless. I discovered that I was officially listed as a co-owner of the company's core architecture licensing system. I had no idea that this legal protection even existed. When I went to the CEO for clarification, he confirmed that it had been added to the contracts years ago to protect me from exactly the kind of political interference Richard was now attempting. Because I owned the rights to the system's core logic, I was essentially the only person who could legally authorize major updates or changes. This meant that if I ever left the company, the entire platform would technically become unusable. Richard lost his first major internal battle when the legal department informed him that he couldn't fire me or change my role without my own written consent. I watched him storm out of the legal office, his face a bright shade of purple. He had spent years treating me like a servant, never knowing that I was actually a partner in the empire he thought he owned. The irony was so perfect that I had to hide a smile as I walked past his office. The temporary hire was now the one holding the legal deed to the company's future. Richard decided to make one final, public attempt to embarrass me in front of the entire board of directors. During a high-stakes strategy meeting, he interrupted my presentation to loudly question my basic qualifications and technical background. He told the board that I was out of my depth, and that the company was taking a massive risk by letting me lead the new rollout. I remained perfectly calm, waiting for him to finish his long-winded rant. Just as he was about to continue, the CEO entered the room and silenced everyone with his presence. He looked directly at Richard and said, "Actually, Vivienne is the only reason this company still operates today." A dead silence fell over the room as the board members looked from the CEO to me in shock. Richard froze, his mouth hanging open as his world finally cracked wide open in front of his peers. He had nowhere left to hide and no more lies to tell. The CEO then asked me to continue my presentation, and the board listened with a level of attention I had never seen before. I realized then that the battle for my reputation was over. Richard had tried to use the board as a weapon against me, but he had accidentally given me the stage to prove him wrong for the last time. After the disastrous board meeting, Daniel finally saw exactly how far his father had gone in his attempt to destroy me. He came to me that evening and actually apologized for not defending me during the dinner and the earlier attacks. He looked genuinely ashamed of his own weakness. However, he also gave me a very serious warning: my dad won't stop easily. He's going to fight even harder now that he's been humiliated. I realized then that this conflict was escalating far beyond simple workplace politics. It was becoming a full-scale war for the soul of the Caldwell family. Richard was a man who defined himself by his power, and now that it was being taken away by his daughter-in-law, he was becoming truly dangerous. I started taking extra precautions, both at work and at home, knowing that a desperate man would do almost anything to reclaim his pride. I saw a side of the Caldwell family that I had never seen before, a cold, calculating desperation that made me realize I could never truly be one of them. I was ready to take the company keys, but I was also getting ready to walk away from a marriage that was built on a father's shadow. I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, and I wasn't going to let anyone trip me up again. The following week, the CEO announced a highly confidential initiative to the senior leadership team. I was being given the temporary control keys to the company's entire global infrastructure during a critical rollout test. This was the highest level of responsibility ever given to an employee in the company's history. When Richard heard about the assignment, he became visibly shaken and almost lost his composure in the hallway. He loudly called the decision irresponsible and a disaster waiting to happen, but the CEO completely ignored his outbursts. Richard knew that if the rollout was successful under my leadership, his own influence would be permanently erased. He spent the entire day trying to find ways to interfere with the testing phase, but my new security protocols kept him locked out of the sensitive areas. I could feel his eyes on me every time I walked through the executive wing, a mixture of hatred and fear radiating from his office. I was literally holding the keys to the kingdom, and he was nothing more than a spectator in his own company. I went home that night knowing that the next few days would decide everything. I was nervous, but for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. On the second day of the global rollout, a sudden and massive system failure occurred that threatened to take down the entire network. At first glance, it looked like a standard technical glitch, but my security logs immediately suggested something much more sinister: intentional interference from an internal source. Someone had tried to sabotage the rollout to make me look incompetent in front of the global partners. Because I held the unique authority keys, I was the only person who could stabilize the system before it reached the point of no return. While the senior engineers were locked out of the core servers, I worked with a calm focus to bypass the sabotage and restore full functionality. I noticed that Richard was suddenly very interested in my location, hovering near the server room and asking the staff if the system was beyond repair. He was waiting for the crash so he could step in and play the hero. But I didn't give him the chance. Within 20 minutes, I had cleared the malicious code and the network was running smoother than ever. I had caught the sabotage in real time, and now I had the digital fingerprints to prove exactly who was behind it. Richard's plan had backfired, and he had just handed me the weapon I needed to finish him. After I regained full control and secured the entire infrastructure, the CEO sent out a company-wide email publicly praising the architect behind the stabilization. He didn't name me directly yet, but everyone in the executive wing knew exactly who he was talking about. Richard's authority began to erode in real time as his own staff started looking to me for direction instead of him. The internal gossip shifted from his career advice to my technical brilliance in a matter of hours. I could see the defeat in his eyes as he walked through the office, a man who was once feared but was now being ignored. He tried to call an emergency meeting to discuss the security failure, but the board members politely declined his invitation, preferring to wait for my official report. I realized that I didn't need to shout to be heard. My work was doing all the talking for me. Richard had tried to use a system failure to destroy me, but he had only succeeded in proving how indispensable I really was. I felt a sense of calm satisfaction as I watched him pack his briefcase and leave early for the first time in years. The temporary hire had officially taken over the building, and there was nothing he could do to stop the change. The shift in power became official during the next board meeting, where several members began openly questioning Richard's leadership after a series of repeated failures were linked directly to his departments. They were no longer impressed by his arrogant speeches or his family name. Meanwhile, my own role was quietly upgraded once again, giving me permanent executive authority over the company's core technology wing. Daniel saw the writing on the wall and told me privately, "You're becoming untouchable here, Vivienne." He looked at me with a mix of pride and sadness, realizing that I had surpassed his father in every way that mattered. Richard was becoming a ghost in the hallways, a man who still held a title but had no actual influence over the company's future. He tried to start one last rumor about my secret meetings with the CEO, but nobody was interested in his drama anymore. I was now the one setting the agenda and making the decisions that moved the company forward. I walked into the office every morning knowing that I had earned my place at the table through hard work and integrity. Richard Caldwell had tried to treat me like a pawn, but I had played the game better than him and ended up as the queen. The final blow came when internal investigators finally traced a series of past financial manipulation attempts back to Richard's personal influence. The CEO called me into a secure room and asked me to review the evidence confidentially, knowing that my technical expertise would help confirm the fraud. As I looked through the records, I realized something horrifying. Richard had been hiding his own department's massive failures for years by blaming them on other people, including me. He had purposefully sabotaged projects just so he could point the finger at incompetent staff members to protect his own bonus structure. I saw my own name on several disciplinary reports that I had never even been told about, all forged by Richard's office. I felt a surge of cold anger as I realized the full depth of his betrayal. He hadn't just been mean. He had been a criminal who was willing to destroy my life to save his own skin. I handed the files back to the CEO and told him that I would testify to the digital evidence if needed. Richard's web of lies was finally being unraveled, and for the first time, he was the one who was truly vulnerable. I was no longer his victim, I was his judge, and I had all the proof I needed. Richard finally snapped and confronted me privately in a deserted hallway late one afternoon. His face was contorted with rage as he blocked my path, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You think you're better than me now, don't you?" he spat, his eyes wild with desperation. "You think a few system keys make you a Caldwell?" I didn't flinch or look away. I simply looked him right in the eye with a calm that seemed to unnerve him. "No, Richard," I responded quietly. "I think I finally have proof of who you really are." For the first time since I had met him, he had absolutely no comeback. He just stood there, his mouth working silently as the realization of his total defeat finally sank in. He looked old and defeated, a man who had built his entire identity on a lie that was now being exposed to the world. I walked past him without a second glance, leaving him alone in the shadows of the building he once thought he owned. There was no more drama, no more shouting, just the quiet reality that his time was over. I went back to my office and continued my work, knowing that the emergency leadership meeting the next morning would be the final chapter in his career. The next morning, the CEO called an emergency leadership meeting that included the entire executive board and senior management team. The atmosphere was electric as everyone waited for the announcement that would change the company forever. The CEO didn't waste any time. He revealed that Richard Caldwell would be immediately removed from all executive influence pending the results of a full criminal investigation into financial fraud. A collective gasp went through the room as the board members processed the fall of one of their most powerful peers. Richard sat in the back of the room, staring at the floor as his legacy was dismantled in front of everyone. Then, the CEO turned his attention toward me and spoke in a clear, resonant voice. "Vivienne Hartley will hold the company keys moving forward as our new chief operating officer," he announced. I felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over me as the board members began to applaud. I had survived the attacks, the sabotage, and the insults to become the very person my father-in-law feared most. I looked at Richard one last time and saw that he was finally seeing the truth. Power doesn't come from a name or a title, it comes from the work you do when nobody is watching. In the aftermath of the meeting, Daniel finally made the choice to step away from his father's toxic influence forever. He realized that Richard had used him as a pawn just like everyone else, and he was finally ready to stand on his own feet. Richard lost both his professional authority and his control over the family narrative in a single day. He was a man with nothing left but his bitterness. However, instead of seeking revenge for all the years of abuse, I made a surprising request to the CEO. I asked that there be no public humiliation or dramatic press releases about Richard's removal. I simply wanted accountability and for the truth to be recorded in the internal files. I didn't need to see him suffer to feel successful, I just needed him to be gone. Daniel and I decided to take some time apart to figure out our own future, away from the shadow of the Caldwell estate. For the first time in many years, I felt a deep sense of peace and freedom. I was no longer fighting for my life, I was finally living it on my own terms. I had won the war without losing my soul, and that was the greatest victory of all. At the final company ceremony of the year, the CEO stood on the stage in front of the entire staff and handed me a symbolic set of company keys. He looked at me with a proud smile and said, "Vivienne, you built this company's future with your own hands. Now, you will be the one to protect it." I stood on that stage, looking out at the hundreds of people who now relied on my leadership, and I felt a sense of responsibility that I was finally ready to carry. Richard was watching silently from the very back row, a man who finally understood that his era was over and that the truth had won. I didn't gloat, I didn't speak loudly, and I didn't need to make a scene. I simply accepted the keys and the new role with the same quiet dignity that had gotten me there in the first place. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all, true power doesn't need to announce itself to be real. It proves itself through integrity, hard work, and the courage to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. I walked off that stage and into my new life, knowing that I was the architect of my own destiny. The story of the temporary hire was over, and the story of the leader had just begun.